Everyone keeps saying Linux runs better than Windows even for gaming, and after a lifetime on Windows I decided to finally test if the hype is real. So I bought a second SSD, moved my setup over and spent over a week testing it for single player games, daily use and competitive shooters. And what I found out completely surprised me. So if you've been thinking about making the switch, this is the raw truth before you waste your time. And I'm gonna start with day one. So when I asked my Linux expert friend which Linux to even get, the answer was Ubuntu. It's the easiest one to start with, it gives you the least problems and it's the simplest to dual boot next to Windows. Now the install is about as simple as installing Windows. You download Ubuntu for free, flash it onto a USB stick with Rufus, turn off fast boot in your BIOS and boot from the drive. A few minutes later you're on your desktop, nothing complicated. Now everyone tells you that the real magic on Linux is the terminal. It's just like a black screen where you type commands instead of clicking around. But here is why it actually scales better than on Windows. On Windows when you want a program you open the browser, find the site, download an installer and click through 5 menus. On Linux you type one short command, it grabs the program, installs it and set it up in the background. One line and you're done. And that's exactly how I set up the basics. I updated Ubuntu, installed my Nvidia drivers and got Steam running, all from that one black screen. Now I download my main competitive rotation and figured I start with the finals. And here is the first thing you quickly realize on Linux. Not every game runs the same way. A few titles run natively, meaning they're built directly for Linux, but since 90% of your library is made for Windows, Steam uses a compatibility layer called Proton. Now Proton basically translates Windows API calls on the fly so they can run on Linux without the developer ever touching like a line of code. You toggle it on in the settings and most of the time it just works. And then there was the finals, which just flat out refused to run. No shaders, no loading screen, it simply would not launch. So of course I spent an hour finding this one game until I found the problem. When I installed Steam through the terminal, Ubuntu quietly gave me a snap package. It's basically heavily sandboxed version of an app. Now that isolation blocks the exact permission Proton needs to run anti-cheat like easy anti-cheat. It was basically trapped in like a digital cage. I had to wipe it, go to Valve actual website and download the native installer instead. And to make it even worse, because the snap version hid my files inside its own sandbox folder, the new Steam couldn't see the data. I had no choice, so I deleted everything and re-downloaded all 8 games from scratch. And after the install, basically the finals finally launched and ran completely normally, like nothing had happened. But now we get to the metrics that actually matter for competitive games, the frames. And this is where Linux and Windows really split. The finals ran smooth, but the frame rate was clearly lower, somewhere around like 20 to 25% below my Windows baseline. Then I decided to jump into CS2. Since it runs natively on Linux, I figured the performance gap would shrink, but it actually got wider. On Windows my frames sit comfortably about like 480, exactly what I need to fully use my 480Hz monitor. Now on Linux, CS2 dropped down to like 320, 350, and losing over 130 frames on a panel like this isn't just like a numbers game. It completely changes the frame pacing and fluidity you need when you're pixel tracking at a high level. And to be completely fair here, and the Linux community will rightfully point this out, I'm on an Nvidia GPU. Nvidia drivers historically don't work as well with Linux as AMD's open source stack does. High-end setups on AMD cards report a much smaller performance gap, sometimes matching Windows performance entirely or even like surpassing it. So keep in mind these benchmarks reflect my specific setup, Nvidia on Ubuntu. So if you're running an AMD card, your ceiling will likely be higher. And I also tried forcing CS2 through like Proton instead of native Linux port to see if the translation layer handled the engine better, but it actually made them worse. I started getting massive micro stutters every time I started shooting, clear input delay and a strange artificial smoothness to the mouse input. And if you have like thousands of hours like I do in tactical shooter, especially in CS, your muscle memory catches that instantly. So the raw performance takes a hit on Nvidia hardware, but then I ran into a barrier bigger than frame drops. Games that just like won't run at all. And the main one that didn't make it for me was Apex Legends. It won't launch, no matter how much you tweak it, and it's not a translation issue, it's like an intentional block. EA completely disabled Linux access back in late 2024. Now the anti-cheat they use is fully capable of running on Linux. It did for years, but they flipped the switch off. They say the open nature of Linux makes it too easy to develop and hide cheats, making it impossible to reliably separate clean accounts from bad ones. And Fortnite is basically the exact same story. The tech works, the developer just refuse to trust the platform. Then you have Valorant and League of Legends, which fall into a completely different situation. Those games rely on Vanguard, and Vanguard isn't just disabled on Linux, it physically cannot run. It's written to hook deep into the Windows kernel at a level that doesn't exist in Linux security model. Now Riot would have to rebuild their entire anti-cheat system from scratch for an operating system with less than like 5% market share, and they've already said that's not happening anytime soon. Now of course none of this means Linux is broken or insecure. Whether it's like a policy decision like Apex or kernel limitation like Valorant, it always tracks back to the same reality. Developers decided the Linux player base isn't worth the overhead. It's not all terrible for multiplayer, anything developed directly by Valve like CS2 or Deadlock work flawlessly without anti-cheat friction. The frames are lower than Windows, like at least in my situation, but the frame pacing is clean enough to actually compete. And now if you step away from the competitive side and look at the single player games, Linux is incredibly strong. This is where the platform genuinely shined during my testing. Most of single player titles just work fine out of the box. Now where you hit like some turbulence is heavily translated titles that put a high load on the compatibility layer. Elden Ring was the perfect example, at least for me. 90% of the time the experience was locked in and fluid. But then I get like sharp sudden stutters right in the middle of a boss fight, right as I was timing a dodge. On Windows that doesn't really happen, and from what I could find online this is because it's a mix of real-time shader compilation and translation overhead, which is why the game feels much better on a second playthrough once your system catches those assets. I have no idea about the technical part, so I might be wrong, but I don't know. Now outside of engine optimization, there is one more factor that might be the actual deal breaker for players like us: your peripherals. On Windows, your mouse and keyboard rely on dedicated software like Razer Synapse to manage your DPI stages, polling rate and macro profiles. On Linux, you can really find these apps for a lot of these brands. There are of course like open source community alternatives, but they didn't recognize my specific setup, for example, and the web-based drivers wouldn't flash the changes. So yeah, it is what it is. Razer in this case sucks a lot. So here is the workaround that I use. Set up your peripherals on a Windows machine first and save everything directly to the mouse onboard memory. Once it's saved at the hardware level, the mouse keeps those profiles no matter what operating system is plugged into. You boot into Linux and your DPI and polling rate are exactly where you left them. Zero software is required. But yeah, of course you need like a dual boot setup. So after all the troubleshooting, the performance drops and the hours spent hunting down settings, where did I land with this? Did Linux actually surprise me? Yes, but not for gaming. As a daily driver, Linux is just better. The entire operating system feels instant, the desktop, the browser, alt-tab being under load, everything is stripped of bloat. And going back to Windows after like a week felt super slow and terrible, and I don't really like it at all at this point. And in the beginning I expected Linux to be worse across the board, just like basically overhyping from a small niche community, and it turned out to be better at almost everything except the one thing I do most, competitive gaming, and in this case it's not even Linux's fault. And here is the honest breakdown depending on what you play. Competitive FPS player on Nvidia, do not fully wipe your Windows, just use like dual boot. Now a casual Steam gamer, just try it, the vast majority of your library will run with no problem. If you're like a single player fan, strong yes, just expect a slight performance tax on translated titles if you're like an Nvidia hardware. And if you value privacy, a fast environment and a clean system, it's an easy recommendation. And if you absolutely hate troubleshooting, don't start with stock Ubuntu, look into like gaming focused distributions like Bezite or Nobora that pre-configure your graphics drivers and Steam dependencies out of the box. Now for my setup the decision was simple. I didn't wipe my main drive, I threw in a second SSD and set up a dual boot. Linux now handles a lot of my daily workflow. Windows is just like a boot option for that competitive titles that refuse to run anywhere else. So stop picking an operating system camp and just use the right tool for the job that you want. Now let me know in the comments which Linux operating system you actually recommend, and if you're on Windows, if you would ever decide to go to Linux. And if you want to see more about gaming peripherals or just like tech in general, check out this next video.